Hello, I'm Érika working as an art historian at the University of Lyon in France.
Hello, I'm David Guba. I work at Bard Early College in Baltimore City, and I got my PhD at Temple University in 2018, and I study 19th century France.
I'm Allison Downes, and I'm Associate Professor of Modern European History at Western Sydney University in Australia, currently a Research Fellow at the Hans Wissenschaftskollege in Germany.
Hi, I'm Katrin Schultheiss, Associate Professor at the George Washington University, teach Modern European History, in my last 6 days of being chair of the History Department there. So I think I've been designated the kicker-offer of this discussion session. So I loved the papers. I listened to them all yesterday, and I found them all fascinating. I was actually amazed at how well they fit together, given that everyone submitted them individually. And I just thought that, to talk about especially 19th century, but, going into the 20th century, 18th century, ideas about what constituted the proper sort of purview of medicine was a theme that ran through them all. And this idea that concepts come out of other areas, whether it's colonization, empire, or out of the world of art, or out of demography, these concepts are coming up out of the public interest, or in my case, hypnotism, and then medicine kind of horns in on it and tries to figure out where its place is in that discourse. And I thought it might be interesting to talk a little bit about that intersection of issues of public interest and medical expertise, because especially in the 19th century is just this time when the medical profession is figuring out what its role is, trying to gain in professional organization and professional prestige, and trying to police the borders of its expertise. So I thought maybe it'd be interesting to talk a little bit about that. In my case, with hypnotism, that was one of the major themes. Hypnotism had been banned as a topic of medical expertise. And then in the middle of the 19th century, as with a lot of these other topics, in the middle of the 19th century, you see this burgeoning interest of the medical profession in hypnotism, which had only really continued as a topic of interest in the general populace. So I don't know if other people have thoughts on that kind of intersection.
Yeah, I think to me, 19th century French medicine is so incredibly explorative, right, of all the different dimensions of things that could be of concern to doctors. So there really seems to be this incredible openness to what might be considered to be in the purview of medical science and treatment. And, it's interesting for me to hear papers on things like hypnotism and the smell of paint and hashish, because, when you read 19th century medical theses, they come bound in all of the theses that are published that year. So I've had often the opportunity as a historian reading on a specific topic, just flick through and see what else people were doing their medical theses on, and I've seen some of these topics as medical theses, as pedagogic topics, and so it's incredibly interesting to me that we've managed to get papers on all of these themes in one panel. I guess it's a good moment for me to ask a question that I see as probably being relevant both to Érika and to David's paper, and that is about the influence of miasma theory in 19th century medicine, because to some extent, right, you'd expect this to be declining, at least by the middle of the 19th century, that there'd be less of the concept of miasmas as we have this sort of the bacterial turn and the Pasteurian turn. And yet it's very clear that actually some of these ideas don't go away, and they continue to be important for things that relate to odor, right? That the odorous things are still viewed as both object of suspicion, but also as a possibility of medical intervention because of their having thought to have a specific effect on the nervous system. So I'm kind of interested in what you guys might say about that, because I've been really struck by these things that hang around for so much longer than we might think in medicine in the 19th century. And I'm also interested in to what extent these questions relate to gender, because it's very common in medical texts of the 19th century that we see women described as more nervous in general. So there's a sex differentiation in terms of the humoralist approach, and women are more likely to be seen as having the nervous constitution. And miasmas were thought to affect the nervous system. So there is some extent that you would think people drawing on those kind of ideas would be more likely to see things like paint fumes being problematic for women, or even hashish being more problematic. So yeah, I guess apart from those general sort of questions, so my earphone just keeps popping out, which is why I'm playing with it all the time. I'd be interested to know, David, if you've come across anything about hashish and gender, or specifically sexuality, because I've also come across discussion of hashish products in some of the medical sources on aphrodisiacs in the 19th century, which was completely surprising to me. I only realised this last year. But anyway, that's about 4 questions, I guess.
Érika, would you like to go first?
I do wish. I don't mind.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Just concerning the miasmas, I was interested to say that in the text I presented, they were written from the mid 18th century to 1839. They all concern painter's colic, this disease well known in relation with the smell of paint. And something surprising for me is that I never ran into any mention of smelling or inhaling or something involving the way in which the smell of paint were having an effect on the body of the sick people. And there are still some doubts apparently at this time concerning the way the smell affects people, whether it's by touching or being in presence of, or smelling or sniffing or anything. It's still unclear at this time, and I find it interesting because at the end of 19th century, we know that the French word inhaler, it's an English inhale, I think. It appears at the very end of the century, and it becomes very important and fashionable for many pathologies. Concerning women, it's indeed the nervous system is also very importantly involved in this process, because at the end of 18th century, it's very well known, and it has been observed by many historians. There is a kind of shift or a turn in the way we see smells, and it involves from this time the nervous system in a very important way. And for this reason, women were told and asked all the time not to be exposed to perfume, and they were supposed to exhale a lot of perfumes and to love perfumes. So they were supposed to not to do what they wanted to. Concerning the smell of paint, it was extremely important, because the smell of paint is not, of course, the smell of the colors themselves, but the smell of oil or turpentine or things like that, which makes the paint perenne. That makes that makes the paint last a long time on the canvas. And due to this prevention against the smell of paint, many women just gave up on oil painting, a lot of them, according to a dictionary of artists of the time, and then they started using other mediums, like pastels, for instance. And the problem with pastels is that they don't remain through the time. And due to this problem, many pieces of art of women were lost over the last centuries.
Interesting. Thank you.
So the question about anti-contagionism, Anticontagionism was incredibly important, as I said in my paper, for the medical logic underpinning why these physicians were going to use hashish in the first place. And when I started reading the sources, particularly in the first 19th century, it was clear, and other works have shown this, other historians, and it was clear that anti-contagionism was the dominant idea, at least until I'd say the late 1840s, and it started to wane in the 1850s and 1860s. But I was incredibly struck in my research, and I talk about this in the book, there was a lot of contention. So doctors would go out of their way, almost in a sort of a showboaty way, and I would compare it to the doctors that are talked about in the paper on hypnotics. There was one doctor, Guillaume, who would go in the 1830s, and he was so convinced of anti-contagionism that he would sit in the bed of cholera patients specifically and try to, and he would wear the clothes of cholera patients and try to prove to people, this isn't a contagious disease. Look, I can do this. And clearly they were anti-contagionists, thinking that it was caused by miasmas hitting the central nervous system and then causing the body to have these reactions leading to death. The contagionists, were equally not, they didn't fully understand what was happening either. So they, I would call them almost transmissionists, which was the middle category. But I guess what I'm trying to say is there was a significant amount of conflict between anti-contagionists and contagionists. The other thing I found, which is also reported in other secondary sources, is that anti-contagionists were more often associated with the forces of progress or sort of liberal ideas, more associated with sort of Republican governments, and contagionism was more associated with authoritarian governments who wanted to put quarantines down and restrict personal freedom, something we're sort of dealing with in a new variety and a new degree today with the coronavirus. So that was another element that was pushing and pulling the debate of anti-contagionism versus contagionism. So the miasma theory, I guess, to conclude on that point, was incredibly important, along with homeopathy, or what was then called more simile-based therapies, where if I'm going to treat somebody, I'm going to give them something that mimics the symptoms to combat the symptoms that are caused by the disease. So anti-contagionism, this idea that it's a central nervous system disease, whether it's plague or cholera, they're pretty much in the pre-germ theory era viewed as the same in the literature that I've read. And then hashish came in as this perfect remedy, something that excited the central nervous system to such a degree that it could counteract the effects of this anti-contagionist understood disease of plague and cholera. The issue of gender is something that I absolutely need to work more on in this story, because in the immediate, or the first reading of my sources, there wasn't much discussion of gender really at all in the interpretations of hashish or its intoxication or what that intoxication meant. There was a lot of discussion, I guess, where gender showed up the most was in discussions of patients that were treated with hashish, particularly for insanity. But I didn't, there were definitely connections to notions of hysteria, women being more open or susceptible to losing willpower or rational thinking. There were certainly elements of that present in the literature, but hashish seemed to be, in the eyes of these doctors, particularly people like Jacques-Joseph Moreau, the famous Dr. X of the Club de Hashichon. Hashish seemed to be an equal opportunity intoxicant that suspended reason for men, women. It did not matter because of this association with the Orient, with the Muslim world that I talk quite a bit about in my paper and also my book. So I'm hoping that the more I search into the late 19th century, into the early 20th century, that I'll see, because clearly women were using cannabis in France as well. There's an excellent magazine cover. I can't remember the magazine. It's slipping my mind. That has a picture from 1889 of two very sort of stereotypical bourgeoisie members of the Belle Epoque sitting back, smoking hashish, and out of the poof of the smoke is the 1001 Nights. So, and it's a man and it's a woman sitting right next to each other, consuming this product and imbibing this sort of narrative of Oriental otherness. So women are there, women are present, and gender is definitely something that's going to play a bigger part into the 20th century, especially around the 1950s and 60s. I've started to find more information. But yeah, that's the next step in my work. Sorry, I'm long-winded.
It's interesting to hear you talk about that, David, because So Charcot, Jean-Martin Charcot, is at the center of my larger work and figures in my paper as well. He was actually famous or infamous for experimenting a lot with hashish in the late part of the 19th century, in the 1880s in particular. And there were a lot of, he had a lot of critics, and one of the ways they liked to spoof him was to show him as like just going around totally stoned on hashish all the time. And there are some cartoons too. You can see there, it's funny that I haven't seen the one that you just referred to, but there are cartoons where he's sitting there and there's a whole big cloud around, like a word balloon, a thought balloon with all these crazy images in it. And the idea was that, he was fascinated by the idea of losing your will and losing your willpower. And that was obviously at the center of hypnosis, and the idea of a split personality and dreams and all of these things that obviously Freud would run with later. But hashish was apparently important for him in trying to figure out, they're just trying to figure out the unconscious, right? And hashish becomes, at least the way it's described, and he doesn't talk a lot about his own experience with it, but other people describe it as a way of accessing one's own unconscious. So was that part of the discussion? I mean, you talk a lot about these alleged curative powers of hashish, but was it also, are there inklings of this idea that you can access the unconscious through hashish in this earlier period?
Certainly in the romantic literature of Gautier and Baudelaire, although Baudelaire is very, if you read Le Paradis Artificiel, it's incredibly down on hashish. It alienates the mind, it's bad for art, it's nothing like wine, which is the soul and lifeblood of France and all the wonderful, artistic creations that come out of France. So there is some discussion in the romantic literature. I would say Gautier's pieces in Revue de Dumont, those are probably the best pieces that talk about this attempt to unlock some sort of unconscious element trapped inside or threatened by modernity to a certain extent. That's sort of the romantic reading. So there's certainly a lot of that. Moreau, as a scientist, because he had, one shoe was a scientist shoe and one shoe was more of what I would call exploratory and trying to figure out sort of the reaches of the subconscious and what insanity was truly like. So he talks in his 1845 treatise on hashish and mental illness about sort of trying to get to the roots of the unconscious. But he's more concerned with insanity, the loss of, which he really describes it as a physical ailment that causes one to lose will, and sense of time also was really important there. So the unconscious wasn't as important. I think that, as you said, that's something that comes up more in the later 19th century. But it was present. It was more associated with the soul. People were still wrapped up in especially people who were anti-hashish. This guy named Brière de Boismont, very famous alienist at the time, Catholic moralist is how I would describe him. He talks about the unconscious as well, but from sort of the perspective of a soul. So it was there in my opinion, but it wasn't as powerful as it becomes in the late 19th century. Sources I'm looking at right now in Algeria, French Algeria in the late 19th century, are absolutely talking about the unconscious, hashish, and the effect of hashish on particularly the subconscious of French Muslims, indigenous in Algeria. So that's something I'm working on now, but yeah, that's my answer to that.
Okay.
I had a question, and I think this sort of, if that's okay, and I can talk less.
Yeah, go for it.
I really liked the comment, I forget who made it, sorry, about these scientists being so exploratory at the time, because they absolutely were, and the bound dissertations are a great testament to that. And you can see, even in the digital sources, you can go through and see those as well, all the dissertations that came out in a particular year. But I'm also struck at the same time by how aggressive many of these physicians and practitioners were with professionalization. So exploratory in terms of let's include as much stuff as we can inside the medical logic and toolkit, but professional, very narrow in terms of who can use it, where they need to go to do this, the scholarship or the journals they need to publish in order to be respectable. That's sort of going on at the same time as the exploratory is going on. It then narrows, I think, by the 19th century into the 20th. But this sort of these phases of exploratory and narrow linking with professionalization. I didn't really know what to make of that in my own research, and I was curious as to what you might make of that in yours.
Yeah, I just have a few thoughts on that. I mean, it does seem like that, this is a time when the professional identity is trying to form itself. And it's particularly interesting in the area of psychology, where there's trying to split off from philosophy as well as, religion and other kinds of ideas. But I do think that it's no coincidence that the exploratory and the kind of trying to figure out what the narrow bounds are of the profession is, because they're trying to figure out what their legitimate territory is. And at times they're grasping at more ground, right? And then at other times they're trying to police their borders. So policing your borders and trying to expand your borders is that's a tough professional row to hoe. And I think you can see it happening in the 19th century. I think the late 19th century is actually where you could see it most vividly, where they start like the 1892 law of professional boundaries, where they delineate very clearly who can call themselves a doctor or what a legitimate medical practice is. And I think before that, I mean, there's still attempts to do that, but they don't have the authority quite to kind of clamp down on what's legitimate medical practice and what isn't medical practice. I mean, I think I'd like to hear from Alison in particular about the ways in which, you see this with demography, and you see, hygiene, and hygiene is the realm of doctors, but it's also the realm of politicians. And I mean, there's a lot of different professional overlaps, and I wonder if you see a kind of turf struggle there over professionalization.
Yeah, my word. I mean, it's actually probably one of the things preoccupying my thoughts most at the moment with the book that I'm working on, because it's clear to me that there is such a tremendous engorgement of ideas around the space of hygiene in French medicine in the first half of the 19th century, and particularly associated with the Montpellier Vitalist School, but you also see it in the Paris context as well. And I don't think I really understood to what extent that early hygiene movement before. I mean, in doing similar work in the past, I really hadn't focused so much on that. And I don't think I understood the extent to which what they're really talking about is more or less a model of preventative medicine. In fact, they use the term preventative as well as the term hygiene. And so when you sort of rethink it in those terms, it's actually quite fascinating, because on the one hand, there is a tremendous growth of medical professionals throughout this period, right? Between 1800 and 1830, right? It more or less triples the number of medical doctors. And so these are people who need to create markets. And from one perspective, it seems like their insistence on the need for older women to have medical care, even though it's clear that they're not more likely to die in old age than men are, that to me seems like it has something to do with that need for patients. But on the other hand, their own discourses about hygiene are to some extent making themselves obsolete, right? Because they're really trying to say, well, that all of these medical conditions may not need to be treated if they are prevented in the first place through these interventions we make in terms of diet and sleep and movement and fresh air and all the other things that they cluster into the hygienic model. And so it turns doctors, I guess, more into professionals of a pedagogic kind, rather than people who are going to treat you. And that idea, I'm quite fascinated by where it goes, because by the end of the 19th century, it seems fairly obsolete, and certainly with the rise of pharmaceutical medicine, it becomes completely degraded. And we now see a resurgence of it in all of the kind of lifestyle medicine and popular medical approaches. But yeah, I think there's really a lot more work to be done on hygiene. It's a much more complex topic, both in terms of its socioeconomic sort of foundation and in terms of the complexity of the discourse itself.
Is it politicized in this earlier period? I mean, is hygiene something that becomes a political question? Are there? I know it does later, obviously, when it becomes all about pronatalism and that kind of thing, and then it becomes this hugely political topic, but in the earlier period, is it a political issue as well, or is it largely within sort of scientific circles?
We certainly see it too in the public engineering discourse about sewage reconstruction and urban planning. So hygiene, that is, I guess, where we first start to see it used in that more familiar sense to people, you know, in our time, where it's relating to sanitary cleanliness and all those sort of questions. And of course, in Baron du Châtelet's 1830 text about the hygiene problem of Paris sewers, prostitutes are clustered in there as part of the problem, so that you end up having the cleanliness question combined with sexual morals and behaviours. So I think you find a more complex thing happening there. But certainly in terms of pronatalism of the kind you see in the early 20th century, that isn't a major concern in the first half of the 19th, or even later in the 19th century. In the sort of text that I'm looking at, they certainly have the idea that having babies is good for women's health, so that it fits in hygiene in that sense. But it's just one of about
dangerous
10
too, isn't?
Yeah, exactly.
Interesting how very dangerous moment, and yet if you don't have children, then you're doomed to some kind of horrible fate, right? So
yes, that's a curious paradox. They do insist on that being the main danger to women's health, and the more that demographic information becomes widely spread into French medicine, the more people realise that is the main issue for women's health. Actually, that they're likely to die in childbirth. But at the same time, they always keep talking about the importance of doing what nature wishes, like following nature's les vœux de la nature. And that includes all of the things that peasant women have to do to survive, but it also is having babies, preferably quite a few.
Interesting.
I would think about this.
Can you speak up, Érika? It's hard to hear you.
Yes, I can try to scream.
Yeah, good. Perfect.
I was talking about this novel by Goncourt brothers. You know, Chérie, the main character, she dies because she doesn't have kids. She's 18 or not even 20 yet.
Very dangerous.
Apparently it's based on the medical treatise of the time.
Yeah.
So maybe it could be a nice example. Talking about this exploration, there is something I found very interesting in my resources. It's a thesis, a medical thesis, in which on the effect of smells on the body, generally speaking, and specifically on women. And included in the thesis, there were a letter from Élie Zola, and the medical student asked him to give his opinion on the topic of his thesis. And I found very interesting to see how this student, who was studying to be a doctor, started to include some history, some literature in his background, and exploring largely a very large panel of practices related to perfume. On the other hand, in fact, it's obvious in the history of perfumery how charlatanism was very frightening for people. They were scared to try to cheat on the quality of the product, on the medical issues related to smells and everything in this area. And talking about this professionalization of medicine and how people were protective and in research of recognition at the time, I don't know if I'm wrong, but I think it's from the 19th century that it's prohibited for people like me to call themselves doctors. Apparently in France, still today, it's forbidden if you're not a medical doctor to use these titles, contrary to other countries in the world. And I found it very interesting, in fact, that apparently there were a lot of charlatanism at this time.
Definitely, which is why you get that whole series of laws in the 19th century to try to define who can legitimately practice medicine and who cannot.
Can I ask you a question, Katrin?
Yeah.
Yes, I was very happy that you started by Béziers, and at many times in your paper you mentioned many towns in France, which is rare because usually studies on French history are very focused in Paris. And I wanted to know how do you relate these tours you mentioned and the fact that you can observe this fascination for hypnotism everywhere in France at different moments. How do you relate it? Do you relate it to the rest of your research and to the main topic?
Well, yeah. So that incident that I start out with, which took place in Béziers, I mean, that was part of a traveling show. So in that sense, you saw these popular displays of hypnotism everywhere throughout France, and you saw it throughout Europe. I mean, actually didn't see that much in England, but you see a lot in Northern Europe and in Southern Europe and in the United States. So that was not Paris-centered at all. And in fact, if anything, you would see less of that kind of popular hypnotism show in a place like Paris, where there were so many doctors and the professional grip on what was legitimate practice of medicine was much stronger, and there was a much looser, obviously there were plenty of doctors in Béziers too, but the power of the profession was really centered in Paris. So I don't know, I've never seen any acknowledgement by these popular hypnotists that they're going to steer clear of Paris, and they don't. I mean, you see in advertisements in daily newspapers about how so-and-so is going to be instructing the general populace in how to hypnotize people, and you could sign up for these sessions and you could attend classes. So that was happening in Paris as well. But these big shows, those tended to be in other towns, provincial towns, and especially small towns. Where the whole village would gather it was the big spectacle they weren't always as dramatic as putting a girl in a lion cage. That was kind of the peak of drama. But they were often they would come through and, a gathering would occur, and it could be in any town in Paris. And the fact that it was so widespread was what caused so much concern. And the doctors, the medical profession being so centered in Paris felt like it didn't have a grip on controlling medical practice outside of a very narrow circle. And I think that's partly why you see in 1892, that's when they cracked down on those second tier medical practitioners and say that doesn't exist anymore. We're going to have you either are a full-fledged doctor or you're not. And here's what you can do as a doctor, and here's what you cannot do if you're not a doctor. And that becomes very important by the late 19th century. And I think practices like these pseudo doctors or these people doing things like practicing hypnotism in, county fairgrounds, basically, is one of the things that stimulates the desire to crack down on the officiers de santé and the other practitioners like that, and to regulate practices like there are efforts to regulate all kinds of quasi-medical procedures. And the question is hypnotism a medical procedure? And that's what the big debate is, right? About whether is hypnotism and the kinds of states that it leads to, is that something that is the purview of a doctor, or can anyone, as the Nancy school would argue, everyone can be hypnotized. So why is this a medical practice at all? It's interesting, now that I'm saying this, interesting with Allison's idea of menopause, is it is this a medical moment or a medical concern? The same debate you see with hypnotism. Is this a concern of medicine or not? And as you point out in your paper, Allison, it's not really resolved at all. And doctors pretend that hypnotism is resolved by the late 19th century, but it really hasn't. There's still many people saying, no, this isn't a medical concern at all. This is something that anyone can do and everyone is susceptible to. So it's kind of interesting there that one's dealing with the mind and states of mind, and the other's dealing with the body. But I think there's a lot of overlap there.
Mm-hmm. One thing that strikes me increasingly too with some of the work that I've been doing in recent years is how much pharmacists throughout most of the 19th century kind of just sell whatever the hell they want.
Oh yeah.
There's not a great deal of regulation, or to the extent that there is, it's very easy to resist it, pay the fine, and then still make a profit on what it is you're selling. And it's mainly proprietary combinations that are regulated to the extent that they are at all. But individual products, you can sell whatever you want. And certainly when you look in the apothecary lists and the products that are being sold, all sorts of surprising things in there, including hashish and including all sorts of new world products that clearly enter the pharmaceutical market and have this unofficial existence as medicaments that are not, they're not recommended by medical authorities, and are they prescribed by doctors? It's not entirely clear. If all of them are, and some of them certainly you can just walk in and buy them. So it's curious because we think of pharmacy as part of medicine, but it really for much of the 19th century appears to have been doing kind of its own thing altogether and not really being subject to the same sort of professionalization.
I think that's right. I don't know. I don't know when they start regulating it, to be honest with you, certainly through the 19th century, you see all those ads, the basically patent medicine where you can, these miracle cures. I'm sure that's why hashish became so popular. Like there's no equivalent of a Food and Drug Administration at all. That's certainly a 20th century, those kinds of controls. So you see plenty of ads for various, it was really just a business. Whatever you could hawk, you could sell. And doctors are prescribing stuff. Although I don't know the extent to which every kind of medicine that was prescribed to doctors was just available on the street. I doubt that, but certainly people could hawk anything they wanted, which is why hashish kind of took off. But hashish was also, as I understood it from your paper, David, hashish was actually recommended by, and it was scientists and doctors who were saying this will cure cholera, or this will cure the plague. That wasn't just the word on the street, right?
Right, and I guess I have a chapter that looks at French pharmacy and its professionalization in the 19th century. And hashish, as I argue, or I try to argue, hopefully successfully, was incredibly important as a tool that was used by pharmacists to sort of draw a line in the sand and say, I am a pharmacist and this is my profession. In terms of the laws, I mostly agree. You don't find the court cases you mostly find are two pharmacists suing one another over who had the right to priority to a particular drug. I find tons of those. Those are excellent. But you don't find like the state coming in and telling a pharmacist, no, don't sell this, because there are definitely exceptional cases where people die and the state steps in and things like that. But in 1845, there's a Poisons Act that's signed, or that's created. And then nothing is really created in any real way until 1916. And then they make an enormous list with 3 different tiers, A, B, and C. There might even be a 4th tier, D, and hashish and cocaine and opium and a whole lot of things that are not even used today in pharmacy practice were added to that list. So after 1916, you start seeing the state come in. And I'm actually looking at a case right now with the Grimaud company, which is a massive pharmaceutical company that was also tied to the cosmetics company or the perfumery Rigaud in Paris. And they sold cannabis cigarettes, also laced with arsenic and a bunch of other nonsense, opium as well. And they sold them as an asthma remedy. And they were globally, they were everywhere, pretty much everywhere. The British Empire loved them. The French Empire loved them. They're in the United States. And after 1916, they passed this law. Grimaud wasn't allowed to sell them in France, but they basically pushed everywhere they could to keep selling these products. And eventually the League of Nations comes in and they pass an opium statute in 1925. And Grimaud actually sends somebody to Geneva to argue to keep cannabis out of this, or at least give them the exception. And they do get an exception. And they can sell them everywhere outside of France. They sell them all the way up into the 1950s, which is fascinating. But in terms of professionalization, I would argue that in the early 1800s, there absolutely was a movement inside French pharmacy to take the market away from the apothecaries, to professionalize standards, to standardize the schools of pharmacy across Paris and across different cities like Lyon. And they also created professional organizations. They created numerous journals. They did all the same things that other professions were doing to stake claim as a profession. But yes, if you open a pharmaceutical pharmacopoeia like Dorvaux's L'Officine, you're going to find a wild, wild west of sort of pharmacy products that you can buy without much of a doctor's note. The doctor's note becomes incredibly important towards the late 19th century, and that's consistent in the United States and Germany and elsewhere.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Well, it is time to wrap up. Sadly, I think we could probably talk about these things for another hour quite easily. So it's really great to meet you guys, and I really enjoyed listening to all of your papers. So thanks for those. And David, we are, I guess, done.
Wow, too bad we're
Qui attend